On the night of August 23, 1939, rain fell softly on the cobblestones of Moscow, muffling the sound of hurried footsteps inside the Kremlin at exactly 11:14 p.m. Pens touched paper beneath the glow of yellow lamps, sealing an agreement that would quietly redraw the fate of millions. Outside, the city slept. Inside, history shifted. New guns fired, new bombs fell. Yet this moment would soon turn trusted partners into enemies locked in a war of annihilation. In a small office nearby, junior clerks stacked documents without knowing their true weight. Cigarette smoke hung low, maps were folded and unfolded, borders traced with calm fingers. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, as if everyone understood that silence itself was part of the weapon. Across Europe, soldiers trained under the assumption that alliances were fixed, that enemies were clear. But on this night, certainty dissolved. Agreements were signed that promised peace while quietly preparing betrayal. In Berlin, news would be celebrated as strategic brilliance. In Moscow, it would be framed as necessity. To the rest of the world, it would remain hidden, at least for now. The true cost would not be counted in ink, but in blood spilled months later. The betrayal was not loud. It did not announce itself with marching boots. It arrived disguised as diplomacy, and for the men who would soon face each other across frozen fields and shattered cities, this moment unseen, unheard would decide who lived, who died, and who would be remembered as ally or enemy. As the ink dried, the silence deepened, the night moved on, but nothing was the same anymore. That silence carried forward into the weeks that followed, into military briefings and newspaper headlines carefully worded, and into the minds of commanders who began to plan for a future that now included a secret they could not reveal. And as dawn approached over Moscow, the paper rested quietly on the table, unaware that it had just become one of the most dangerous documents of the 20th century, leading directly into the world that had shaped it. The agreement signed that night would later be known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. On the surface, it promised peace between two powers that had publicly condemned each other. Beneath that surface lay secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. For the men who signed it, Vyacheslav Molotov for the Soviets, Joachim von Ribbentrop for Germany, it was presented as strategy, not morality. Both sides believed that they were buying time. Both believed they could control the future. But history does not remain obedient. For soldiers on both sides, this pact created a dangerous illusion. Training manuals still described the other as an ideological enemy, yet official orders now demanded restraint. Officers were told to cooperate, to exchange supplies, even to coordinate movements. Confusion spread quietly through the ranks. One such officer was Captain Alexander Morozov, a logistics commander stationed near the newly defined border in eastern Poland. His job was simple: manage transport routes and maintain order. He followed instructions. He believed alliances were temporary, but duty was permanent. Across the line stood German officers doing the same. Shaking hands with men they had been taught to hate, photographs were taken. Smiles appeared stiff and forced. Beneath them lay suspicion. For civilians, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Borders shifted overnight. Families woke up in new countries without moving an inch. Arrests followed. Deportations began. The agreement that promised peace delivered disruption instead. Morozov watched trains pass eastward filled with frightened faces. He recorded numbers, not names. That was his role. Still, the unease grew. Something about this cooperation felt unstable, like ice forming too quickly on a river. He was not alone in that feeling. Many sensed the pact was not an end, but a pause. And pauses in war are often more dangerous than open fighting. As months passed, Germany expanded westward, while the Soviet Union consolidated its gains. Public statements praised neutrality. Private reports warned of preparation. Trust eroded even as cooperation continued. By the spring of 1941, Morozov noticed changes. German supply movements increased. Reconnaissance planes flew closer. Conversations grew shorter. The smiles disappeared. The betrayal was approaching, carried not by diplomats, but by divisions of men and steel. And as the illusion of alliance began to crack, those who had believed in the agreement were left standing on ground that was already shifting beneath their feet, pulling them toward the transformation that no one could stop. By early June 1941, the border no longer felt neutral. It felt tensely stretched thin by forces pretending not to exist. Captain Morozov received new instructions daily, each one more cautious than the last. Fuel depots were quietly relocated. Bridges were reinforced without explanation. Silence replaced reassurance. On June 21st, the night was unusually still. Morozov stood outside his command post, listening to the wind move through tall grass. Across the river, German positions were dark, too dark. No patrols, no lights. It felt wrong. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the silence shattered. Artillery tore through the sky. Explosions lit the horizon. The betrayal was no longer hidden. Operation Barbarossa had begun. German forces surged across the border in overwhelming numbers. The pact, once hailed as a masterstroke, dissolved instantly into fire and blood. Allies became enemies in a single moment, without warning to the men ordered to die. Morozov barely had time to react. Communications collapsed. Units were in roads filled with retreating soldiers and civilians fleeing west to east, chased by aircraft overhead. The transformation was immediate and brutal. Men who had shared supplies weeks earlier now fired upon each other without hesitation. There were no explanations, only orders. Trust turned to survival. Morozov organized evacuations, destroyed warehouses to prevent capture, and watched carefully prepared plans fall apart. He realized then that betrayal on a strategic level always lands hardest on the ground. For the civilians, the cost was worse. Towns were bombed without warning. Refugees clogged every road. The agreement that once promised stability had left them defenseless. Within days, the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. Millions were captured. Entire units vanished. The speed of the advance shocked even experienced commanders. Morozov survived the initial chaos, retreating east with remnants of his unit. He no longer thought about treaties or signatures. Those belonged to men far away. What remained was responsibility for the soldiers beside him and the civilians behind him. The betrayal reshaped everything. It hardened resolve, erased illusions, and transformed a political gamble into a war for survival. What had begun as a calculated pause between enemies became one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. And as Morozov marched east under burning skies, he understood a truth learned too late. In war, betrayal is never shared equally. It is signed by a few and paid for by millions. That realization followed him into the long years ahead. As cities burned, winters froze armies in place, and the line between ally and enemy became permanent. The transformation was complete. The world that had existed before August 23, 1939, was gone forever. In the weeks following June 22, 1941, shock turned into grim realization. The betrayal was complete, and now the question facing commanders on both sides was not why it had happened, but how to survive what came next. The impossible idea emerged quietly in staff rooms and ruined headquarters. Total war without restraint. For the German High Command, the decision had already been made. The invasion was not just military, it was ideological. The former ally was now labeled an existential enemy. Orders filtered down that stripped the conflict of compromise. Cities were to be encircled, not negotiated with. Supplies were to be seized, not shared. Mercy became optional. On the Soviet side, disbelief hardened into determination. Commanders who had trusted the pact now faced annihilation. Captain Morozov saw the shift immediately. Retreat was no longer a temporary maneuver. It was survival. Entire supply routes collapsed under constant attack. Rail lines were bombed faster than they could be repaired. The impossible idea took shape under this pressure. If the enemy could not be stopped at the border, they would be stopped by distance, exhaustion, and denial. Scorched earth tactics expanded. Villages were evacuated. It meant sacrificing land to save people. A decision as brutal as it was desperate. Morozov received orders to oversee the destruction of fuel depots his unit had built alongside German engineers only months earlier. The irony was bitter. He remembered shaking hands over blueprints that now went up in flames. The betrayal had turned cooperation into a liability overnight. For soldiers, the psychological shift was devastating. Many had believed the pact would keep the war distant. Now it was everywhere. Former allies advanced without hesitation, using maps drawn during peacetime cooperation to strike supply nodes with precision. The idea that alliances were temporary became undeniable truth. Survival demanded adaptation. New defensive lines were planned deeper inland. Factories were dismantled and moved east. Civilians were mobilized into war production almost overnight. Morozov watched trains packed with machinery roll away under fire. He understood the scale of what was happening. This was not a battle, it was a transformation of an entire society forced by betrayal. The impossible idea was no longer theoretical. It was being executed in real time. Give up space to gain time, lose cities to save nations. Every decision carried unbearable cost. And as the front moved relentlessly eastward, the betrayal that had begun with ink on paper now demanded payment in fire, hunger, and endurance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would consume everything between them. The execution of that impossible idea unfolded across thousands of miles. German forces advanced rapidly, confident in their momentum, unaware of how deeply the betrayal would trap them. Soviet resistance hardened with every kilometer lost. Morozov's unit became part of a defensive web designed not to win immediately, but to bleed the advance. Supply convoys were ambushed, roads were sabotaged. Weather became an ally as autumn rains turned fields into mud. Former cooperation now worked against the invaders. Infrastructure they expected to lay destroyed. Warehouses stood empty. Villages were silent. The speed that had defined the early invasion slowed, but the cost was staggering. Civilians paid the highest price. Evacuations were chaotic. Families were split. Hunger followed displacement. Morozov recorded numbers of German refugees, losses, destroyed Assetspot. Now each figure carried faces he recognized. German units, frustrated by delays, escalated brutality. Reprisals became common. Entire towns vanished. The betrayal fed a cycle of violence that hardened both sides. Winter arrived early. Equipment failed. Soldiers froze. What had begun as a swift campaign turned into a war of attrition. The illusion of control dissolved under snow and resistance. Morozov survived encirclement, retreated again, then finally held. He watched new defensive lines solidify. The betrayal had failed to deliver a quick victory. Instead, it had awakened a war that would not end easily. By the time the front stabilized, both sides understood the truth. The moment allies turned to enemies, the conflict had crossed a line from strategy into survival. There would be no return to negotiation, no resetting of trust. The execution of betrayal was complete. What followed would decide not just borders, but the future of millions. And the world would never look at alliances the same way again. By the end of 1941, the consequences of betrayal were impossible to ignore. What had begun as a calculated agreement between two powers had ignited one of the most destructive phases of World War II. The collapse of trust reshaped the conflict into a war of total survival. The former allies were now locked in a struggle that consumed cities, erased borders, and shattered entire generations. The invasion stalled, but at an unimaginable cost. Millions were dead, captured, or displaced. The scale of violence far exceeded anything anticipated when the pact was signed. Historians later agreed that the betrayal fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. It ensured that the conflict in Eastern Europe would not be short or limited. Instead, it became a grinding war of attrition, marked by extreme hardship and relentless loss on all sides. The pact's secret protocols, once hidden, were eventually revealed. Their exposure confirmed what civilians had already suffered, that their lives had been negotiated without their consent. Entire regions had been traded like pieces on a board. Captain Morozov survived the early years of the war, but many around him did not. He witnessed how the illusion of diplomacy collapsed under the weight of ambition and fear. For soldiers, the lesson was brutal and clear. Political agreements mean little one's weapons are drawn. The betrayal also reshaped post-war memory. It became a warning, studied by future generations, that alliances built without trust, transparency, or humanity carry consequences far beyond the signing table. What remains historically significant is not just the military outcome, but the human cost. The betrayal turned cooperation into catastrophe and ensured that the Eastern Front would become the deadliest theater of the war. Long after the fighting ended, survivors struggled to explain how quickly certainty had vanished. Veterans spoke less about ideology and more about confusion, the shock of waking up to find yesterday a ally, now an enemy. Captain Morozov returned home years later to a country changed forever. He rarely spoke of the pact itself. Instead, he spoke of faceless soldiers who never came back, civilians who vanished on roads heading east, towns that existed only in memory. The legacy of the betrayal is not held in documents alone. It lives in graves without names and families without answers. It reminds us that decisions made in secrecy often demand payment in public suffering. Rebuilding took decades. Trust, even longer. Today, the story stands as a human lesson rather than a political one. It shows how fear and ambition can override morality, and how ordinary people carry the burden of extraordinary decisions they never made. The betrayal did not end when the war ended. Its echoes shaped borders, alliances, and caution for generations that followed. And in that sense, its legacy remains unfinished. This is the history of World War II. Whoever oppresses the innocent is an oppressor. Neither the earth belongs to this oppressor, nor does the sky belong to him. We stand now and forever with the oppressed. This is WW2 Files. See you in the next one.